Still think a contractor's job is unstable? She said, leaning against the new beam, apron strings loose, eyes finding mine across the empty diner. I looked at her once. Slowly. I'm starting to think it has its benefits. She reached up and tucked one blonde strand behind her ear without looking away. Good. Because I've got a ceiling that needs holding up. And apparently, so do I. I didn't move. Didn't need to. Before we begin, has someone ever walked into your worst night and turned it into something worth staying for? Drop it in the comments, subscribe, and let's begin. My name is Cord Halsey. I'm a structural contractor out of Knoxville, 41 years old, divorced once, and the kind of man who can walk into a room and tell you, before he even sits down, which wall is load-bearing and which ceiling is about to lie to everybody underneath it. I've spent 2 decades reading buildings the way other men read people, slowly, carefully, looking for the places where the stress has been hiding long enough to become dangerous. I am not, by any reasonable measure, a romantic man, which makes what happened to me on that warm May evening all the more surprising. The dogwoods were still holding their last white blooms. Honeysuckle was doing its best to sweeten the air through the cracked diner windows, fighting a losing battle against burnt coffee and fryer grease. I was sitting across from a woman named Kara who had checked her phone 3 times since the pie arrived, and I was quietly accepting that this evening was not going to redeem itself. Then she came to the table. The waitress. Blonde. Not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet, sunlit kind that looks earned rather than chosen. Hair loose over one shoulder, white tank top, black apron tied tight, pinned behind her ear. She set a sweating glass of ice water down without being asked. And then she didn't look at Kara. She looked at me. If you wanted, she said, low, clear, no performance in it whatsoever, I'd sit in your booth all night. It didn't sound like a line. It sounded like an honest offer from someone who had decided life was too short to be indirect about things. Her eyes were tired and sharp and warm all at once. Kara scoffed and went back to her phone. My heart did something my brain hadn't authorized. I opened my mouth, and then I heard it. A sharp crack above us, the sound of a board that was done pretending. Dust drifted down from the drop ceiling. My eyes went up, and 16 years of job sites translated what I was seeing in about half a second. Move, I said. I shoved the table sideways, pulled Kara out of the booth, and pushed her toward the aisle. Behind us, the drop ceiling buckled. Wet insulation and broken tile crashed down onto the seat where I'd been sitting 2 seconds before. A light fixture swung, sparked, and went dark. The diner erupted. But through all of it I heard her voice, clear, certain, already in motion. Front and back doors, both sides. No phones, just move. She was already guiding an older woman toward the exit. Her other hand still held the tray, like she'd decided there were things she simply didn't drop. I went back inside to check the damage. The beam above the booths was dark and swollen, the joists soft with months of hidden water damage. This wasn't bad luck. This was a building that had been asking for help for a long time. I came back to the door. Nobody goes under that span until it's braced. She nodded once and went for the supply closet. We built temporary supports from mop handles and milk crates. Ugly and imperfect, but enough to take the load. Water ran down my wrist from somewhere above. I wiped it off and checked the line again. That was when the front door opened. The man who walked in was not a customer. His jacket was clean. His boots were spotless, which told me everything about where he'd been standing while his building came down around a woman inside it. He looked at the waitress like he owned the room. Marlo, he said. Smooth. Practiced. So that was her name. She was behind the counter now, shoulders squared. Get out, Reed. He smiled like she'd invited him to sit. I heard there was an incident. I want to help. She pulled a thick, worn folder from under the register and dropped it on the counter. Bank letters. Red stamps. The kind that mean nothing good. You already called them, she said. He didn't deny it. Outside, through the cracked window, a dark SUV idled at the curb. Lights on, engine running, pointed straight at the diner like it had been waiting all evening for exactly this. I looked at the folder. I looked at the building. I looked at Marlo, standing there with her worn paperwork and her straight spine, and I thought about the drive home I'd been planning 10 minutes ago. I pulled a stool up to the counter and sat down. MS. Marlo, I said, how long has Callaway owned the note on this property? Something shifted in her eyes. Not quite hope. The door to it, opening a crack. 14 months, she said. And the code violations, did the bank cite them? Or did the complaint come from a third party? She turned the folder to face me. The header read, Reed Callaway Development, LLC. Notification to lending institution. I read it. Set it down. The honeysuckle was still coming through the window. My date, I realized, had been gone for some time. I hadn't noticed. I wasn't sure I minded. All right, I said. Let's see what we're actually dealing with. I stayed until midnight going through that folder. Marlo made coffee. Real coffee this time. Not the burnt institutional kind, but something dark and honest from a small press pot she kept behind the counter for herself. She set a mug in front of me without asking. I took it without thanking her, because we had already moved past the part of the evening where small courtesies felt necessary. We were in the part where there was work to do. The folder told a story that made me tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Callaway had acquired the loan 14 months ago from a regional bank that had been quietly offloading small commercial notes. The purchase was clean on paper. What came after it wasn't. Over the following year, he had filed 3 separate notifications to the lending institution, each one citing a different concern. A grease trap irregularity, a ventilation question, and now, most recently, structural integrity following tonight's ceiling failure. Each letter was worded carefully, technically, just close enough to legitimate to be difficult to argue with. He's been building a file, I said. Marlo stood on the other side of the counter, both hands wrapped around her mug. I know. How long have you known? She looked at the window. Outside, the parking lot was empty now, the SUV long gone. Since the second letter. I just didn't know what to do about it. That didn't cost money I didn't have. That landed quietly. I turned another page. The loan documents themselves were dense, the kind of language that's designed to make a person feel like understanding it requires a degree they don't have. I read slowly. I turned pages back and reread sections. Marlo refilled my mug once without a word. And then, near the back, between a standard default acceleration clause and a boilerplate arbitration paragraph, I found it. A cure clause. 30 days. If the borrower brought the loan current and demonstrated code compliance within 30 days of a formal default notice, the lender was required to accept the cure and halt foreclosure proceedings. It wasn't highlighted. It wasn't mentioned in any of Callaway's letters. It was just sitting there in the fine print, quiet and patient, the way useful things sometimes wait to be found. Marlo, I said, come look at this. She came around the counter and read over my shoulder. I watched her lips move slightly as she worked through the language. Then she stopped moving and went still. Is that real? She said. It's in the original loan agreement. He can't make it disappear. She straightened up slowly. I could see her doing the math, the kind that has nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with whether you can afford to believe something good. The violations, she said. The grease trap, the ventilation, all of it. Fixable. Every one of them. The grease trap is a service call. The ventilation question he raised is a code reference from 2009 that was superseded. I'd bet money on it. And the structural damage. I looked up at the brace ceiling, at the mop handles holding weight they were never designed to hold. That's mine to fix. She was quiet for a moment. The loan balance. To bring it current. It's not a small number, Cord. It was the first time she'd used my name. I had introduced myself somewhere in the first hour, somewhere between the folder and the temporary bracing, and she'd filed it away and used it now like she'd been waiting for the right moment. How much? I asked. She told me. I didn't react. I've learned over the years that the moment you react to a number is the moment you lose the room. I thought about my savings account. Years of early mornings, job site winters, contracts finished on time and under budget, money set aside with the quiet discipline of a man who'd been through one financial disaster already and had no interest in a second. It was enough. Just enough, if I was honest with myself, which I try to be. I have a proposal, I said. She crossed her arms. Not defensive, careful. There's a difference. I'm listening. 50-50 partnership. Equal vote, equal stake, no clause in the agreement that advantages one party over the other. I cover the loan balance and the repair costs. You keep running the diner the way you've been running it, because from what I've seen tonight, you know how to run it. We put everything in writing and both of us read every word before we sign. She looked at me for a long time. Why? She said. You don't know me. No, I agreed. But I know the building. And I know what it took to keep this room calm tonight, when that ceiling came down. That's not nothing. Outside, the spring dark was warm and still. Someone had strung work lights across the parking lot. My crew, who I'd called at 10 o'clock and who had shown up without complaint the way good crews do. Through the window, I could see them moving in the yellow light, unloading lumber, checking measurements, beginning the slow, honest work of putting something back together. Marlo looked at the folder, then at the window, then at me. I read every page, she said. Before I sign anything, I read every page. I'd be concerned if you didn't, I said. She picked up the folder, and for the first time since I'd sat down at her counter, something that was almost a smile moved across her face. We signed the partnership agreement on a Tuesday morning, at the same counter where I'd first read the loan documents, with 2 mugs of coffee and a notary named Pete, who drove out from town without complaining and only charged us for the gas. Marlo read every page. I watched her do it, slowly, methodically, finger moving along certain lines the way you do when you want to be sure your brain isn't skipping ahead. She asked 3 questions. They were the right 3 questions. I answered them straight, and when she was satisfied, she signed. Her handwriting was small and even, the kind that doesn't waste space. My crew started the real work that same afternoon. There were 4 of us. Me, Danny, who had been with me 11 years, a younger guy named Trace who was stronger than he looked, and Keely, who was the best Finnish carpenter I'd ever worked with and who had strong opinions about lumber grades that had saved me money more than once. We pulled the damaged drop ceiling in sections, stacked the debris in the parking lot, and got our first clean look at what the water had actually done. It was worse than I'd shown Marlo. Not catastrophic. I wouldn't have let anyone into the building if it were, but the main beam had been compromised further back than the visible staining suggested, and 2 of the secondary joists needed full replacement rather than sistering. I made a note, adjusted the material order, and kept the information to myself for about 4 hours before I decided that wasn't the right way to run a partnership. I found Marlo in the kitchen, prepping what she could for a reopening that didn't have a date yet. The damage runs further than I thought, I said. Another 4 feet along the main beam. It adds time and materials. She set down her knife. How much time? 2 more days. Maybe 3. She nodded. Tell me what you need. That was it. No argument. No panic. No drawn-out negotiation about who absorbed the cost. Just, tell me what you need. I have worked with a lot of people over 20 years, and that response, simple, steady, forward-facing, is rarer than most people understand. We fell into a rhythm over those 2 weeks that felt natural in the way that only genuinely compatible working relationships do. Mornings were for structural work, heavy, loud, the kind that leaves dust in your teeth. Afternoons, when the crew broke, Marlo and I would go over the compliance checklist, grease trap service documentation, the ventilation code question I'd flagged and confirmed was obsolete, the inspection schedule with the city. Evenings she cooked for the crew, nothing elaborate, just solid food that arrived at the right time, and the guys started showing up a little early in anticipation. The dogwoods outside were still blooming. Through the open front of the diner, we'd removed the door temporarily for material access. The spring air came in clean over the sawdust and primer. One evening, near the end of the 2nd week, I was on a ladder checking the new beam connections when Marlo came and stood below me with 2 cups of coffee. She looked up at the fresh lumber running the length of the ceiling. It looks different, she said. It's straight, I said. The old one had been sagging for years. You probably didn't notice because it happened slowly. She was quiet for a moment. That's how a lot of things happen. I climbed down and took the coffee. We stood there in the half-finished diner, string lights running from the door to the back wall, the smell of new wood mixing with the honeysuckle still coming in off the parking lot. Calloway came by the bank again, she said. Doc called me. He tried to argue that the cure window had already closed. I had been expecting something like this. It hadn't. No, Dot told him the same thing. She had the clause pulled up on her screen before he finished the sentence. A pause. He's not going to stop. No, I agreed. He's not. She looked at her cup. Does that worry you? I thought about the folder. About the 3 carefully worded letters. About the SUV in the parking lot that first night. Engine running. Lights on, already there before the ceiling had even finished falling. It makes me want to finish the job correctly, I said, which I was already planning to do. She looked at me sideways. Something moved in her expression, not quite amusement, not quite something else. Then she reached over, grabbed the front of my hoodie in one fist, and kissed me. Quick and certain, the way she did everything. Like she had considered it, decided, and acted, all in the same motion. She let go, took a sip of her coffee, looked back up at the new beam like she was checking the line. "Good work today," she said. I stood there for a moment with my coffee cooling in my hand. "Yeah," I said eventually. "You too." Outside, Danny pretended very hard to be focused on something in the truck bed. Trace found something urgent to examine on the far side of the parking lot. Keely didn't bother pretending at all. She just grinned at the lumber and said nothing, which was somehow worse. I went back up the ladder. The morning we went to the bank, Marlo wore her hair down. I noticed because in 2 weeks of working side by side, I had only ever seen it pulled back, practical, out of the way, the choice of someone who had too much to do to think about it. That morning it was loose over her shoulders, the same quiet blonde it always was, and she had on a clean white shirt tucked into dark jeans. She looked like someone who understood that certain rooms require you to show up as the best version of yourself, not because the room deserves it, but because you do. I wore my cleanest jacket and boots that didn't have concrete on them. That was about the best I could manage. We had the cashier's check in a manila envelope, the loan balance, calculated to the day, with a cover letter I had drafted and Marlo had revised until every sentence said exactly what it meant and nothing more. Alongside it was the compliance documentation, grease trap service receipt, the ventilation code clarification I'd pulled from the city records office, and a signed inspection report from a licensed building inspector named Gary Foss, who had walked the diner 2 days prior and found everything in order. Gary was thorough and honest and had no opinion about Reed Calloway one way or another, which made his signature worth more than a friendly one would have been. That was at her window when we came in. She was a small woman somewhere in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the particular calm of someone who has processed enough human desperation across a counter to have stopped being surprised by any of it. She looked at the envelope, looked at Marlo, and gave a single nod that managed to convey both recognition and encouragement without crossing any professional line. We were 3 signatures into the paperwork when the door opened. I didn't need to look up. I knew the sound of those clean boots on a bank floor. Calloway walked in like he'd been circling the block waiting for exactly this moment. Which, I realized later, he probably had. He was dressed well, as always. He had a man with him I didn't recognize, younger, carrying a leather portfolio, the kind of addition that's meant to suggest legal weight without actually being a lawyer. He came straight to Dot's window. "This transaction needs to be paused," he said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something tight. "There are unresolved compliance issues with this property that the lender has been formally notified of. Any cure attempt is premature." Dot looked at him over the rim of her glasses. She reached to her left, picked up a single printed page, and laid it on the counter facing him. The cure clause, highlighted in yellow. She had pulled it up before we arrived. I don't know if Marlo had called ahead or if it had simply anticipated the morning's shape from experience, but she was ready. "The notification window opened 26 days ago," it said. "The borrower has 4 days remaining. The compliance documentation has been received and reviewed." She tapped the page once with one finger. "The transaction is valid." Calloway looked at the page. His jaw moved. He looked at Marlo, then at me. "The structural repairs," he said. "They haven't been independently verified." I reached into the envelope and produced Gary Foss's inspection report. Signed, dated, licensed contractor number printed clearly at the top. I laid it on the counter beside the cure clause without a word. Calloway picked it up. "Read it." "Set it down." The man with the portfolio hadn't opened it once. "This isn't finished," Calloway said. He wasn't talking to Dot anymore. He was talking to Marlo, and the shift in his tone was subtle, but it was there, something that had stopped performing patience and was showing the harder thing underneath. "A building like that, with that kind of history, something will come up. It always does. You're going to find yourself in the same position in 6 months, a year, and I won't be offering the same terms." Marlo looked at him with an expression I had come to recognize over 2 weeks of early mornings and long evenings. It was the expression she wore when she had already made her decision and was simply waiting for the other person to finish talking. "Reed," she said quietly. "We're in a bank." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he looked at the paperwork spread across Dot's counter. The check, the clause, the inspection report, the compliance documents, all of it laid out clean and complete and entirely beyond his reach. He left without another word. The man with the portfolio followed. Dot watched them go. Then she picked up her pen, made a small note in the margin of her processing form, and looked at us. "Where were we?" she said. Not a question. "We finished the paperwork in 11 minutes. Dot stamped the cure confirmation, made our copies, and slid them across the counter in a neat stack. She didn't congratulate us or make a speech. She just settled her glasses back on her nose and said, "Have a good day," in the tone of someone who means it simply and completely. Outside, the May sun was bright and warm on the sidewalk. Marlowe stood still for a moment, envelope in hand, eyes closed, face tilted up toward the light. She stayed like that for maybe 5 seconds. Then she opened her eyes, looked at me, and said, "Let's go finish the diner." We drove back with the windows down. The dogwoods along the road had dropped most of their blooms by then. White petals scattered across the asphalt like something that had already done its job and was ready to move on. The diner reopened on a Friday. Not because Friday was symbolic or because we had planned it that way, but because that was the morning Gary Foss signed off on the final inspection, and Marlowe decided that waiting one more day for a better reason would be the kind of thinking that had never done anybody any good. We unlocked the front door at 7 a.m. The new floor caught the early light and threw it back across the room in long, warm strips. The ceiling, the real one, solid and straight, new beams running clean from wall to wall, sat above everything the way a ceiling is supposed to, which is to say quietly, without demanding any attention at all. The best structural work is always the kind nobody notices. Keely had touched up the trim the night before. Danny had rehung the corner booth light that had sparked and gone dark the night the ceiling fell. Trace had buffed the counter until it reflected the room back at itself. My crew had put their names into this place without putting their names on it, which is the mark of people who understand what work is actually for. The first customer was an older man who ordered black coffee and eggs and ate without looking up from his newspaper. The second was a nurse still in her scrubs who came in off a night shift with the particular exhaustion that only certain jobs produce, and who held her mug in both hands for a long time before she drank from it. The third was a little girl, maybe 5 years old, who came in with her father and immediately asked for pancakes before she had fully cleared the door. Marlowe made the pancakes herself. By 9 the room was close to full. The sound of it, forks on plates, low conversation, the coffee machine cycling, someone laughing at the counter, settled into the walls like it had always been there. Like the 2 weeks of silence and sawdust had been an interruption rather than a change. I stood near the back and watched it and felt something I don't have a precise word for. Satisfaction comes close. So does relief. Neither one is exactly right. Then the door opened and the room changed temperature. Calloway. He was dressed the same way he always was. Dark jacket, clean shoes. The careful grooming of a man who understands that appearance is a form of argument. He paused just inside the doorway and looked around with the slow, deliberate attention of someone who had come to find something wrong and was determined to locate it. The room noticed him the way rooms notice things that don't belong. The nurse at the counter turned on her stool. The father with the little girl straightened in his seat. 2 road workers near the window shifted to face the room rather than the glass. The old man in the corner booth, the one in the flannel jacket, Hatch, who had been there the night the ceiling fell and had apparently decided this was still his booth regardless of what had happened in between, folded his newspaper deliberately, set it on the table, and simply stared. Nobody said a word. Nobody needed to. Marlowe came out from behind the counter and stood in the middle of the room. Apron on, pen in hand, the same way she stood every morning. She didn't raise her voice. "You're not here to eat," she said. He tried to smile. "I'm a customer. I have every right. You're here to see if I broke." She said it simply, without heat. I didn't. His eyes moved across the room. The new ceiling. The inspection certificate framed near the door. The cure confirmation from the bank, mounted beside it in a plain frame. Marlowe's idea, not mine. His gaze moved to me, standing near the back. Then to the road workers. The nurse. Hatch, still staring with the focused patience of a man who has outlasted harder things than this. Calloway had walked in looking for weakness and found a room full of people who had collectively decided, without discussion or coordination, that they were done with him. There was nothing to argue with, nothing to threaten, no fear to work on. He took a step back, then another. His clean shoes found the door. The bell above it rang as he left. Cold air came in for a second, made the new light sway just slightly, and then was gone. Nobody cheered. Nobody made a speech. The road workers turned back to the window. The nurse finished her coffee. Hatch unfolded his newspaper, smoothed it once, and went back to reading. The little girl asked if her pancakes were almost ready. Life moved on, which is the only real answer to people like Calloway. Marlo let out a breath. She turned and looked at me across the room, and what was in her eyes was something I hadn't seen there before. Not relief exactly, not triumph, but something quieter and more permanent. Like a weight she had been carrying for 14 months had simply stopped being there. That night, after closing, we wiped down every surface and stacked the chairs. The neon sign outside hummed softly in the warm dark. The spring air through the cracked windows smelled like honeysuckle and fresh paint. Marlo came around the counter and stood in front of me. Her hair was down. She reached into her pocket and held out a small ring of keys. Front door, she said, pointing to one. Back door. Storage. Office. She pressed them into my palm. The metal was cool. For mornings when my hands are full, and nights when I'm too tired to get the door. I looked at the keys for a moment. They felt heavier than the cashier's check had. I set them on the counter behind her, slid my hands to her waist. She lifted her hands to my chest, fingers curling into my shirt. When I kissed her, there was no ceiling groaning above us. No crisis. No fryer popping. No rain on the windows. No dark SUV idling at the curb. Just the two of us in a diner that was still standing, in a spring that was almost over, and whatever was going to come next. Which, if I'm being honest, felt like enough. Thanks for watching. If this story meant something to you, please like and subscribe for more unforgettable stories about love, resilience, and second chances.